War taught me that some bullets don't pierce the skin. They go straight through the heart. And the real danger wasn't dying. It was falling in love with someone I wasn't even supposed to look at. There are stories no one dares to tell out loud. Not because we don't have the words, but because the world isn't ready to hear what doesn't fit its logic. I lived one of those stories. And the hardest part wasn't the blood or the gunfire. It was the silence after a touch, the fear inside eyes that didn't speak my language, and the secret I had to bury where the ground still trembled with memory. In the war, yes, I was a nurse, but I was also a woman torn by choices I never learned how to name. While tending to shattered men, one of them looked at me in a way that didn't match the uniform he wore. He was the other side, the wrong side, the side I was taught to hate. But my heart, stubborn and foolish, only knew how to beat. And it did, wildly, out of rhythm, out of time, on the wrong side of the war. Maybe you think you know how this story ends, but let me tell you, what hurts the most isn't what happened. It's what we never got to say out loud. And today, I want to say it. My name is Juanita May Delacroix. I'm 84 years old, living alone on a ranch forgotten by time, out in the New Mexico desert. Out here the dust slips under the doors and the chickens scratch at memories like they're searching for grains of stories I never told. My hair, now silver and braided down both sides, was once hurriedly pinned beneath a white scarf stained with blood and salt. Back then, I was just a young volunteer nurse behind the lines of the Korean War. A girl with trembling hands and a heart that hadn't yet learned what it meant to lose someone just because the world decided so. Now, sitting in this old rocking chair with the smell of earth drifting through the window and the wind whispering forgotten promises, I've finally chosen to unlock a door I've kept shut for over 6 decades. Because some things can't be taken to the grave. Some secrets deserve a little air before it's too late. So come on in, darling. The house is simple, but the welcome is real. Sit here with me. Pull up a blanket if you want. Close your eyes for a second and listen. Listen with your heart. Because this war story isn't about weapons. It's about love. It's about pain. And it's about a heart that dared to beat where it never should have. And if you feel like this story might be yours too, in some way, go ahead and subscribe. Like this video. Because here we don't judge. Here we remember. Together. I remember the smell before I remember the view. Because war has a smell. A heavy mix of wet gunpowder, torn up earth, and fever-soaked sweat. When I was taken to the field hospital on the eastern coast of Korea, it felt like the whole world was burning. The air itself shook from all the screaming it had already heard. And still, I went. I had no idea what was waiting for me. Just a bag in my hand and a promise in my eyes. To save whatever could still be saved. It wasn't bravery, sweetheart. It was survival. When you're born in a place where everything is dust and silence, like I was, you learn real young that you either move or you disappear. So I moved. I crossed oceans, swallowed fear, and stitched up wounds on men who couldn't even pronounce my name. The American nurse, they'd say. But inside I was just Juanita, from New Mexico, with small hands and a heart that still believed kindness was something you carried in your pocket. The outpost was way too close to the fire line. You could hear the ground rumble at night. You could feel the moans coming from the front lines. Like the whole world was burning with fever. We slept in already dirty uniforms, 'cause you never knew if you'd wake up to sirens or to blood. And it was there, between syringes, bandages, and blood-stained maps, that I started to understand what it really meant to be a nurse in a war story. I thought I'd be treating bodies, but I treated silence. I treated eyes that didn't want to open anymore. I treated soldiers who were afraid to close their hands. 'Cause they couldn't remember holding anything that wasn't a weapon. There was so much pain, so much. But in the middle of all that chaos, there was something else. A presence. A shadow that kept showing up in the halls. Like fate itself wore combat boots. And oh, if I had known where that was heading, maybe I would have shut my eyes. But I didn't. I looked. I saw. And that's where it all began. It was one of those afternoons when the sky looked stitched together with ashes. I was restocking gauze in a cabinet that never stayed full long enough when I heard a commotion outside the tent. You could tell it was serious by the way footsteps changed, the way doctors stopped talking and started running. And when they rolled that stretcher in, I swear, for one whole second, the world went silent, and all that was left were his eyes. He wasn't the kind of soldier we saw every day. He didn't wear an American uniform. He didn't have that hardened look our boys always carried. He was the other side. A wounded prisoner, they said. The enemy. But in that moment, as he trembled under the seams of the sheet, and his blood mixed with the dust, all I saw was a scared boy. Someone who'd been far from home for way too long. There was so much desperation in his eyes, but also something that broke me wide open. Calm. I can't explain it. It was like, when he saw me, he'd found something the world had taken from him. And right then, I knew. The way you just know things no book can teach you. I knew that look would follow me. That he was about to enter my life like a paper cut. Almost invisible, but far too deep to ever truly heal. I didn't say a word. I just did what I was told. Cleaned the wound on his shoulder, pulled off the blood-soaked shirt, laid my hand on his chest to check his breathing. And he watched me. The whole time. Without blinking. Like he was trying to memorize my face before the pain wiped it away. Like he already knew. That something had been born there. Something even war wouldn't be able to stop. After that day, he stayed under observation. People kept saying he was dangerous, that he should be transferred somewhere else. But for some reason, maybe a change in command, maybe just a shortage of resources, he stayed. And I started seeing him every day. Sometimes just from afar. Sometimes closer than I probably should have. The nurse and the prisoner. A secret without a name, but with a heartbeat already. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't any of those things people imagine when they talk about forbidden love. It was just a touch. A quick touch, with no spoken intention. But that's when everything changed. Because some touches don't just land on your skin. They go right through you. And what he touched in me that day, no one's ever reached since. He was still recovering. Sitting in the corner of the tent, wrists loosely tied with rope, more for formality than for safety. It was obvious he wasn't a threat. The danger was something else. It was in what he stirred, not what he did. Every time I changed his bandages, our fingers brushed more than they needed to. An accident? Maybe. But our bodies know things before our minds are ready to admit them. And mine had already started screaming before my mouth ever learned to stay quiet. I remember it like it was now. The air was thick, and the smell of alcohol mixed with the scent of freshly cauterized flesh. I leaned in to change the bandage on his arm. A deep wound, already beginning to heal. I should have been focused. I'd always been careful with procedures, but in that moment the world slowed down. My index finger barely grazed the inside of his wrist, and it was like touching a raw nerve. He flinched, and so did I. Our eyes met. I couldn't breathe for a second. Because there was no anger there, no fear. Just this quiet recognition, like he was saying, I know. I feel it too. It was a miracle no one else noticed. But inside me, That was the beginning of the end. We didn't speak. The language between us was something else entirely, made of shared silences, tiny gestures, and breath held too long. I didn't even know his name. Not at that point. All I knew was that he was North Korean, that his eyes were too deep for a soldier, and that somehow my heart had chosen the worst possible moment to want to be understood. That night, lying in my tent, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that touch again. Such a small thing, but it made me feel more alive than anything else since I'd arrived at war. And that's when I started to worry. Not for me, but for him. Because if anyone suspected, if anyone saw what only we knew, he wouldn't stand a chance. And I began to understand that loving in that war was also a form of resistance, but one that came with a price I wasn't sure I had the strength to pay. War is loud. Explosions, screams, sharp commands that cut through the air like a knife. But our conversations, they were made of silence. A living silence, full of things that couldn't be spoken, yet somehow filled the space between us. I used to think silence meant absence. Then I met him, and that's when I learned. Sometimes, silence screams. There was no translation between us, no common language, just glances, and whatever lives behind them. But somehow, every gesture of his came with its own kind of caption. When he pushed the food tray away and looked at me, it was his way of saying the pain was creeping back. When he slowly moved the fingers on his good hand, maybe he was showing he was healing, or maybe he just wanted me to see him. And I did. More than I should have. I started responding too. Not with words, with care. A damp cloth left by his bed on a hot night, an extra piece of bread tucked under the napkin, a longer touch on the shoulder while checking his bandage. Tiny things no one else would notice, except him. And he noticed everything. Over time, we built a language that belonged only to us. Sometimes he would draw in the dust near his bed, using his finger. Symbols what I didn't understand. But somehow they moved me. One time he traced the outline of a flower, then pointed to me. I laughed, and he smiled with his eyes, because his mouth was still held hostage by fear. There was something sacred about that kind of conversation, because there was no room for lies. When you don't have words, all you have left is truth. And truth, in that war, was too dangerous to speak out loud. So we talked like that, in silence, between dressings, between breaths, between the deafening sounds of distant bombs. I'd never felt anything like it before. That kind of closeness that doesn't need touch or kisses or confessions. Just presence. Full presence. Being there with him was my moment of peace in the middle of chaos. And somehow, I think I was that for him too. The only thing that still reminded him of the world before. The world that existed before the war split us into sides and uniforms and roles. But the more our silence grew, the more I feared someone might hear it. Because what we had was invisible, but heavy, and the eyes around us were starting to sniff out that a secret lived there. And secrets, darling, secrets don't survive on a battlefield. It was on a heavy, airless afternoon that everything changed. The post was quieter than usual, a rare lull between waves of wounded. I was organizing the supply tent, shifting gauze from one basket to another, trying to pretend my mind wasn't elsewhere. But it was. It was on him. It was always on him. That's when I found it. A piece of paper at the bottom of a box of IV fluid. Folded, discreet, almost sweating fear. I opened it slowly, like opening my own chest, and there it was. A drawing. Just simple lines, but inside them, everything. The tent from the outside, the the profile of a woman with 2 braids, and beside her, a man lying down, a faint rope drawn around his wrist. It was us. It was our silent story, trying to scream in strokes of charcoal. On the back, a symbol that looked like a word. Maybe a name, maybe a plea. I didn't know. But I kept that paper like someone keeps fire in a cotton pocket. I folded it and stitched it into the lining of my tent, right where no one would think to look. And that was when the ritual began. Every day, a letter, a new piece of our world, hidden between seams. He wrote with charcoal, sometimes with dried blood. Sometimes he just scratched in the dust, and I'd transcribe it onto strips of sheet. No one knew. No one could know, because that wasn't allowed. Because if someone saw, he wouldn't just be punished. He'd disappear. I wrote too. Little by little, I relearned how to speak without words. I drew the sky over New Mexico, simple sketches of my ranch, the chickens, the window with the curtain dyed by my grandmother's hands. I gave him my world, a place where maybe, one day, he could belong. And that became our bridge, our invisible pact. The letters were our strangled voices. We spoke of fear, of pain, but also of the small things. The taste of cold water, the sound of wind at night, the dream he kept having about a child running through a rice field. I wrote about my brother, the one who never came back from the last war, and about why I was there, to heal what the world kept trying to break. Each hidden letter was a dose of life in a place that reeked of death, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. One day someone would notice. Someone would hear the creak of wood, catch the different light in my eyes when I passed his bed. But while it lasted, we were freer there, stitching hidden sentences than any other soul in that field. War divides. But our letters tried to remind the world that even on the wrong side, a heart still knows how to love, even wounded, even in silence. It was always after midnight that the world finally left us alone. When the post went quiet and the other nurses were scattered across thin mattresses in exhausted sleep, that's when I felt most alive. The Korean sky held a darkness so thick, almost liquid, it felt like it swallowed everything whole. But in that blackness, between muffled breathing and the distant cry of some lost animal, I knew he was still awake. There was a precise moment between the last monitor shutting off and the first chill wind slipping through, when our eyes would meet. No words, no grand gestures, just a slight raise of an eyebrow, a turn of the face in the dim light. I knew where he was, and he knew I would come, not to touch, not to speak, just to be. The tents had makeshift curtains that swayed gently in the wind. I passed through them slowly, like stepping into a secret. I'd bring a basin of warm water, sometimes tea hidden in a canteen. He'd pretend to be asleep, but his eyes, those eyes, they were never truly closed, always waiting for me. We didn't touch, not in the way you might imagine. Our love didn't fit into easy gestures. It was made of staying, of listening to each other breathe for long minutes, of sharing a silence too heavy for most to bear. I'd sit on the floor beside his cot, watch his hands. The scars war had begun to etch into him, and he'd look at me like just being there was already healing. Once he gave me a button, that was all. A worn shirt button. Worthless, really. But in the way he handed it to me, fingers trembling, there was tenderness. And in that touch, it was like he said everything he couldn't say. Keep this. Keep me with you. And I did. I sewed it into the lining of my uniform, right next to the letters. Because in that war, love was built from fragments. There were nights when pain leaked through, when he cried softly, soundless tears, when the fever came back and his eyes filled with water. And I held his hand, even knowing it broke every rule, every protocol, every logic of two people from opposite sides of a war. But in that moment, who could judge us? Only God. And even He might have had mercy. Dawn came fast. When the first soldier began to cough, or when the tent's canvas turned blue with the morning light, I'd stand up, wipe away the traces, bend my knees like saying goodbye to something sacred, and leave, alone, pretending, silent. But in those few hours, we existed. Not as nurse and prisoner, but as two tired souls, desperately trying to find shelter in each other. Because when the war slept, love woke up. Sometimes war goes quiet, not out of mercy, but because it's waiting to strike with more cruelty. That day the heat was unbearable. Bodies felt like they were boiling inside their uniforms, and the air in the tent was so thick it was hard to breathe. It seemed like an ordinary day, until it wasn't. I was alone in the back of the infirmary, scrubbing blood from the floor with an old rag and vinegar water. One of the wounded soldiers had passed during the night, and the scent of death still clung to the air, even after they'd taken him away. The rest of the team had rushed off to assist with an emergency evacuation a few kilometers out. I was left behind because it was safe enough. Words from an officer who'd never spent more than 20 minutes inside a surgical tent. But it wasn't safe. 3 American soldiers came in. I didn't recognize them right away, but they were drunk. Bloodshot eyes, unsteady steps. One of them laughed loudly, kicking over a bucket that rolled to a stop near the cot where he was. Where he always was. The other 2 started pacing between the beds, mocking the wounded, tossing out crude jokes that froze my spine. Then one of them looked straight at me, with that crooked grin and a stare full of rotten intent. And I understood. War wasn't the only danger. Sometimes the monsters wore the same uniform we did. I tried to keep calm, told them they were in a restricted area and needed to leave. But a woman alone, in an empty tent, wasn't much of a threat. They laughed. One of them came closer, dragging the tip of his rifle across the canvas floor. He backed me into the instrument table and whispered something in my ear that not even the wind should have to hear. And then he appeared. My prisoner. My silence. My secret. He got up from the bed without permission, his wrists still tied loosely with one of the ropes. His eyes burned. Not with fear, but with something older. Deeper. Like that moment had ripped open a part of him that war had already tried to destroy. He didn't yell. He didn't attack. He simply stepped between me and the soldiers, raised his arms, exposed his wounded body, and spoke. In Korean. Loud. Steady. His words crashed through the air like thunder bottled up for months. I didn't understand a single word, but I understood everything. The soldiers froze. One of them, maybe the more sober one, grabbed the other by the arm, muttering something about punishment, about not worth it. They left slowly, grumbling. And then silence. I was shaking like never before. And he just looked at me, his eyes so calm, so sad, as if to say, I couldn't let it happen. And in that moment I knew. He saved me, without a weapon, without force, just by standing there, just by being brave. After that day, he was punished for getting out of bed without permission, a light penalty, considering what could have happened. But I carried the real weight of that choice, because that day, without a doubt, I understood. This wasn't just a war story anymore. It was a love story. Forbidden, dangerous, unthinkable, but love, the kind that saves, and the kind that destroys too. And maybe someone had seen, because not long after, the whispers began. The word hit hard, Spat out like a bullet that didn't need a gun. Traitor. Just like that. Right to my face. Said by another nurse, a young girl from Arkansas I barely knew, but who'd been sniffing around for days. And that was all it took, just one word, for everything around me to collapse into silence. A silence that hurt more than any accusation. I don't know exactly what she saw. Maybe it was the way I looked at him. Maybe one of the hidden drawings slipped out of my bag, or some whispered exchange someone overheard and twisted into something else. What I do know is that all of a sudden, people started avoiding me. The glances that used to be kind turned sharp. Conversations stopped when I walked in. A few whispered behind my back, and the cruelest sound of all was the stifled laughter, the kind that holds poison, not humor. A superior called me in, looked me dead in the eye and asked, far too gently, if I was emotionally involved with the prisoner. I denied it. Of course I did. That was the only choice I had. I knew what could happen to women like me. Black, poor, from the South, with no family name to shield me. One misstep, even just a whisper of wrongdoing, and the war would swallow you whole, or silence you. But even after I denied it, everything changed. They gave me the toughest tasks, pulled me from the ward where he was, tried to rotate me to a more remote post, but a typhoid outbreak kept me there a little longer. That outbreak was the only thing that saved me from being completely exiled. Or worse. And him? He knew. When he saw me from a distance, his eyes searched for answers. But I couldn't get close. Every step I took was watched, and that killed me more than any punishment. Because what we had, that secret made of glances, letters, and suspended nights, was the only thing keeping me standing. And now, it had become my sentence. That's when I learned how to swallow my sobs whole, how to keep my shoulders strong while my soul caved in. They called me a traitor without knowing a damn thing, without realizing that what I did was care, love, protect someone the whole world wanted erased. As if seeing humanity in a man wearing the enemy's uniform was a crime worse than the bombs falling night after night. And you know what hurt the most? It wasn't the fear of being found out. It was knowing that, in that place, no one would understand. Because love there was seen as weakness, especially a love that dared to cross borders, defy uniforms, challenge flags. A love that had the nerve to breathe in the middle of war. I went to sleep so many nights with that word echoing in my mind. Traitor. But the truth is, sweetheart, I never betrayed anyone. I just loved someone the world taught me to hate. And that's something many people will never forgive. War had already rooted itself in me like dust that clings to skin. You can't wash it off. I moved through each day with my body on high alert. But that day, it was different. It wasn't the sound of bombs or the smell of blood that chilled me to my core. It was the stare of a man, a tall, far too quiet sergeant who watched over the prisoners with a coldness that even ice would be ashamed of. He watched me, and I felt it. Every time I passed near the restricted ward, he was there. Still as a wall, but with eyes sharp as blades. At first, I thought it was just prejudice. I knew plenty of people there couldn't stomach my presence. A woman, a black woman, from the South, a nurse in a war built by and for men. That was too much for some. But soon I realized it wasn't just bias. It was something darker. It was surveillance. One night, they sent me alone to treat a wounded man in the outer unit. It was far, isolated. When I got there, the bed was empty. And then, I heard footsteps behind me. It was him, the sergeant. He didn't touch me, but he spoke, low, steady, with a fury so controlled it made me tremble from the base of my neck to the soles of my feet. He said he knew, that he'd heard about the whispers at night, the things I kept stitched in the tent lining. That one word from him, and I'd be removed, accused of espionage, of aiding the enemy, that no one would stand up for me. Then he laughed. Not a mocking laugh, worse, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who enjoys the power they hold. And then he said something that cut deeper than any blade. War makes people like you disappear, and nobody misses them. I froze. For the first time, I truly felt like maybe it would all end right there. That the secret we were living, this quiet love, stitched together between hours of pain and fear, was about to become our grave. He threatened me without raising his voice, killed me in pieces, one sentence at a time. But in the end, he left me there, with my heart pounding like a war drum. I stumbled back to my tent shaking, vomited into a metal bucket and cried without making a sound. I knew this wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. And if I slipped, even once, it wouldn't just be my life on the line. That very night I left him a letter. I wrote only one word, run, and a drawing, 2 footprints in the sand, leading away from the camp. I knew he'd understand. I knew he already felt the noose tightening too. War could kill us in 1,000 ways, but to die for loving, that was perhaps the cruelest death of all. And in that moment I knew, either we disappeared together, or one of us would disappear alone. The truest promises aren't made in front of witnesses. They're forged in chaos, when skin doesn't have time to lie and your heartbeat drowns out the fear. That's how it was for us. No rings, no rehearsed words. Just the ground splitting open around us, and 2 bodies trying to stay whole inside the impossible. The night it happened started like any other. Heavy sky, the smell of kerosene, everyone's footsteps wired with nerves after whispers of an enemy offensive creeping closer than expected. Then it hit. The first blast made the earth shudder like it was breathing through pain. Then a chain of explosions shoved time itself forward. Screams, bodies running. They evacuated the surgical tent, but I sprinted the other way, straight to him, locked up in the prisoner ward, alone and exposed. Part of the structure was already down, lights flickering. He lay on the floor, arm bleeding again from falling debris. I knelt beside him and shouted the name I'd learned to pronounce in secret, with help from a sympathetic South Korean soldier. The name that never left my thoughts. He opened his eyes and, right there in the wreckage, said one thing I'll never forget. He grabbed my hand, steady for the first time without fear, and whispered, "Stay." I nodded, swore I would, that whatever happened, I'd be there. Then I made my own promise. I took the handkerchief I always kept in my apron pocket, the one Mama handed me when I left New Mexico, and tied it around his wrist. It wasn't a ring or some grand vow, just proof. He had someone in this world, that somewhere out there a woman saw him as more than the enemy. The ground quaked, yet for a heartbeat everything between us went still, like the bombing had gone mute outside, and our tiny patch of dirt turned sacred. We told each other everything we'd never dared say out loud. Eyes touch, breath doing the talking. Another blast hit. I dragged him out with help from another medic who showed up, and we made it. But something shifted forever, because a promise made on a minefield can't be undone. It tethered us for good, even if for good might be short. That dawn, while the whole post burned and soldiers tallied the survivors, I wasn't thinking about the war. I was thinking about him, about that handkerchief around his wrist, and the quiet certainty that from here on out everything would be even more dangerous, and even more real. It wasn't just a handkerchief. It was the last clean thing I carried with me through that war. A square of white fabric, hand-stitched by my mother before I left. She said, "Take this with you, Juanita. When you don't know who you are anymore, hold on to this cloth. It'll remind you of me, of home." And that same piece of cotton, dyed with the stories of the ones I left behind, was what I tied around his wrist that night. After the bombing, the camp became rubble. The tents were thrown back up in a rush, the supplies restocked with whatever scraps were left, and the faces, well, they were never the same again. Least of all mine. I moved differently, slower, heavier, like I'd already gone too far to turn back. The first time I saw him after the chaos, he was sitting in the sun, eyes squinting into the light. But the handkerchief was still there, tied tight around his injured wrist. Dusty, stained with dried blood. But there, and far too visible. It scared me, because in wartime everything becomes a clue. A white cloth around a prisoner's arm might be just a rag, or a confession. I walked over carefully, meaning to pull it off, to hide it, to deny it ever existed. But when I reached for the knot, he caught my hand and said one word. No. Just that. No. His eyes said the rest. It was like he was telling me, "This handkerchief is mine now. It's my home too." And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't carrying a symbol of the two of us. He was carrying courage, choosing, despite the danger, to keep that piece of me against his skin. Because loving in silence wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to remember. Word about the handkerchief spread fast. First whispers, then stares, until a corporal came to me with questions that were far too soft to be harmless. "Where'd you get that cloth? Did you give that to someone? Do you know what it means?" And I lied. Said I didn't know. Said it could be anything. A makeshift bandage. A coincidence. But the corporal's stare sliced through me like a blade, without steel. Because he knew it wasn't coincidence. And so did I. In the days that followed, they watched us both more closely. I couldn't walk near his tent without being shadowed by crossed arms and sharp eyes. The walls were closing in. And that handkerchief had become too dangerous. It was on a rainy night that he gave it back. He didn't say a word. Just left it on my table, folded with a care that tore me up inside, like someone setting a wounded animal back into the wild. There was a stain in the middle. I couldn't tell if it was blood, sweat, or a tear. But inside that scrap of fabric lived everything we had been. Everything we dared to be. I placed it between the pages of a prayer book I inherited from my grandmother. I never wore it again. Never showed it. Weeks later, when I had to move tents during a typhoid outbreak, I found the handkerchief back among his things. He never returned it with words, but he never stopped returning it with presents. He's still here, folded, alive. A witness to a war story no one believes when I tell it. A secret made of cotton, a love stitched by hand and unraveled by the world. In war, most goodbyes have no sound, no hugs, no words, just absence. A body that once was, and suddenly isn't. That's how it was with him. A dry silence, like someone closing a door too slowly to be noticed. But the crash he left inside me never stopped echoing. That morning it rained, and when it rained in Korea, the world felt a little quieter. Boots sank into mud, the wounded burned hotter with fever, and the scent of rust clung to everything. I was called early to the triage tent. New prisoners arriving, bodies without names, without faces, without stories. Just another day in a place where nothing should ever feel normal. That's when I noticed. His bed was empty. The first thing I felt was denial. Maybe he'd been taken for medication or some routine inspection. But the hours passed. Nothing. I asked one of the South Korean soldiers who sometimes helped me with translations, carefully, casually. He dropped his gaze and said only, "He was transferred." Transferred. That word, it wears a mask. It's a curtain. Sometimes it means a prisoner was sent to another camp. Sometimes it means he never made it. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to the commanding officer and demand answers. But I couldn't. I knew the more I showed, the more I'd give away. And what we had, even over, was still dangerous. So I stayed quiet. I returned to my tent in silence, sat on the floor and stayed there for hours, hugging my knees like a little girl trying to disappear from the world. I felt rage. I felt despair. But more than anything, I felt an emptiness I'd never known before. He didn't say goodbye, left no note, no trace. And part of me believed he thought it would be temporary, that I'd see him again one day. But that day never came. I spent the following months trying to do everything right. Walked with my back straight again, spoke only when necessary, smiled without showing teeth. I tried to scrub him from my hands, from my skin. But everything about him was a living memory. The way he breathed in his sleep, the heat of those wordless nights, the letters, the handkerchief, the drawings in the dust. How do you forget that? And that's what hurts most, not having the chance to look him in the eyes and say, "Thank you," or "I'm sorry," or simply, "It's going to be okay." Because sometimes love is exactly that, a road that ends before the bend, a page torn out before the final period. War stole many things from me. Friends, peace, innocence. But what it took from him was even crueler. It took his right to say goodbye, to know what we were, to know what we might have been. Even now, when I watch the rain hit the dry dirt here on the ranch, I feel that emptiness rise again. A silence that speaks, that whispers. A goodbye never said, but still echoing inside me to this day. Coming home after a war isn't like the movies. There's no welcome banner, no slow-motion embrace. There's dust. There's silence. And there's a constant feeling that you left pieces of yourself scattered in a place no one else can see. When I stepped off the transport back in the United States, I carried only a small suitcase, a worn-out body, and a heart crumpled like wet paper. The ranch in New Mexico felt even more remote than before. The chickens still pecked in the same rhythm. The wind still howled through the cracks in the windows. But me? I wasn't the same. My mama hugged me tight, with eyes that tried to read the woman I'd become. But she couldn't, because I didn't even know who that was. Inside, I was nothing but memory stitched together with pain. The war still lived in me, and the love I had lived, that wouldn't let me rest. I tried to resume life, helped at the town market, made preserves, wrote letters to faraway relatives. Sometimes I even smiled. But the taste of what I'd left behind, it was too bitter. And that bitterness didn't come just from loss. It came from the choice, because I chose to love. I chose not to report him. I chose to keep letters instead of turning them in. I chose to stay silent when they called me a traitor, instead of defending myself. And that was my cross to bear. There were days I'd ask myself, what if I had spoken up? What if I'd fought for him? What if? But war teaches you that what if doesn't save anybody. He disappeared in the smoke trail, and I went on living. But living isn't the same as staying whole. In the years that followed, I turned down 2 marriage proposals. One was a kind widower, owned a good piece of land. The other a history professor who loved to write poetry. But neither of them had that quiet in their eyes, the silence that matched mine. I smiled at both, thanked them, then went home alone. I volunteered in hospitals, yes. I took care of others. I did what I could with the same hands that once held a secret no one else ever knew. But I never spoke of him, never told, because saying his name out loud risked making him small, turning something sacred into something cold, something up for judgment. So I kept it all. The handkerchief, the letters, a shirt button I found tucked into a fold of my uniform. I kept them like someone keeps an altar. Because even if the world told me I chose wrong, even if his absence scarred me for decades, it was love, the kind that doesn't unravel. Coming home taught me that war doesn't end when the bullets stop. It lingers in silence, inside those who survive. And sometimes the hardest part of living is carrying what you chose to feel, knowing no one else will ever understand. Some people keep jewelry in safes. I kept letters, not for their market value, but for the weight of memory. Because every line written, every mark, every symbol sketched in charcoal or dried blood was a piece of what we were. A fragmented map of a love no one ever learned to read, except us. I sewed most of them into the lining of an old dress I hung in the back of my closet, tucked inside a thick fabric cover. A dress I never wore again. Not because it didn't fit, but because it didn't fit me anymore, after the war. As if the fabric still held the scent of the field post, of fear, of the sweat from nights when everything was possible, and nothing was allowed. The rest I folded and tucked into my grandmother's old Bible. I knew no one would dare open that book too closely. And if they did, they probably wouldn't understand what they were reading. Because most of it wasn't in English. They were his symbols, his drawings. The things that only made sense if you'd been there. If you'd seen how our eyes spoke when language failed. Over the years, hiding became habit. Every time I moved houses, or later, when I had to stay at my sister's place after Mama passed, the letters came with me, tucked between dish towels and neatly folded clothes. They didn't scream like they used to, but they never went silent either. I was afraid, yes. Afraid someone would find them. Afraid some curious nephew would open the wrong Bible. Afraid that one day, in old age, I'd forget where I put them and toss them out by mistake. But more than fear, there was attachment. I clung to those lines, to that war story made of silence and heartbeats, on the wrong side of the trench. For years I had nightmares. I'd dream of someone reading the letters out loud, laughing, mocking, calling it all made up. I'd wake up with my chest tight, rush to the closet, unzip the fabric cover and run my fingers along the seams of the dress, just to be sure they were still there. And they were. They still are. Sometimes I thought about burning everything, about setting it all free. But I couldn't, because those letters weren't just words. They were the only part of the war that truly belonged to me. The only corner of hell that ever tasted like heaven, even if just for a fleeting moment. I kept those letters like someone keeps a flame in a place without light, like someone shielding a flower that bloomed in the rubble. Because love lived in hiding isn't lesser. It's just quieter, heavier, more ours. And even now, at 84, with my hands trembling and my eyes needing more time to read, sometimes I still take one out, slowly, with the reverence of someone touching a miracle. And I read, and I remember, and I love him all over again. It was during a spring that felt different. The wind blew warmer, and the hens on the ranch started laying early. Life moved on with that kind of normalcy that only fools the eyes, because deep inside, everything was still waiting. Even after all those years, even after all the silence. I got a letter, a brown envelope, no return address, my name handwritten. Shaky, but with the kind of precision that only comes from copying letters in secret. It had a foreign stamp and smelled like mildew and longing. Inside was just one sheet. A single page with 3 words, written in crooked English, like they'd been practiced in the air with a finger, without anyone there to correct them. Still remember you. The hand holding that paper trembled. I sat slowly in the rocking chair, the sun pouring through the window, painting the floor orange. And there, between the chickens scratching outside and the smell of old coffee drifting in from the kitchen, I cried. I cried like someone finding a forgotten piece of themselves, buried deep in the soul. There was no return address, no name. But I knew. It was him. Because no one else would write, "Remember," with that curved R, like the ones he used to draw in the dirt back in the tent. I didn't sleep right for weeks. My mind spun with questions and memories. Had he been alive all this time? Had he tried to find me? Had he forgotten and only just remembered? Or maybe this was his last letter. I decided to write back. Same handwriting as before. Steady, slow. I told him about the ranch, about the New Mexico sky, about the nights I still dreamed of him sitting across from me, forehead damp, eyes lit up. I didn't use names, just feelings. And at the end I drew a flower, like the first one he sketched in the dust. I mailed it to the return postmark, waited longer. Nothing. Then months later, another envelope came. Smaller, this time with an official seal. It was from a South Korean humanitarian group. Inside, a note. "We received your letter too late. He passed away 3 weeks ago from pneumonia. He was in our care. He kept a folded white handkerchief inside a box." That was it. Nothing more. I didn't cry that day. I just sat in silence for hours. Walked out to the porch, sat in the chair and stared at the horizon. The sky was clear, like it had been swept clean from the inside. I thought about the handkerchief, the button, the letters, everything we were, even though we never really got the chance to be. And I thought about time. Time. It's cruel to those who wait. But sometimes just knowing the other person still remembered, even by a thread, is enough to heal half the ache. The reunion wasn't what I dreamed. No embrace, no glance, no touch. But it gave me something even rarer. Certainty. He remembered me. Until the end. And in some way, that was its own kind of homecoming. Some secrets we carry by choice. Others, because there's simply nowhere else to put them. I carried mine for over 60 years. Not because I was ashamed, never that. But because the world, so eager to judge, never understood that the worst scar a war leaves behind isn't the one on the body. It's the one no one ever sees. Now, sitting here in this old rocking chair with silvered braids and skin worn by decades of sun and longing, I can say this with the peace of someone who has lived through it all, and then some. Loving him wasn't my mistake. It was my miracle. Loving a man from the wrong side of the war was the most human thing I ever did in the middle of something inhuman. It's what remained of me when everything else turned to dust. This ranch hasn't changed much. The wood of the front door still creaks when the northern wind blows. The curtains still dance during desert storms. And sometimes, when everything goes still, I can almost hear the sound of his boots on canvas, or smell the charcoal of his drawings in the dust. The past doesn't leave. It just learns to walk a little slower beside us. I kept the handkerchief. I kept the letters. I kept the love. But today, I'm leaving a small piece of it here with you. Because some stories weren't made to die with us. They were made to cross over, to remind, to make someone, somewhere in the world, take a deep breath and think, I felt that too. If you've made it this far, thank you, truly. Thank you for listening with your heart. Thank you for welcoming this war story that is also an emotional story of love, of loss, of quiet courage. Maybe you have your own secret too. Your own silence tucked away. Your own handkerchief tied to someone the world told you to forget. If you do, leave a comment below. Tell me you heard. Tell me this story found a home in you. Because sometimes, all we need is to know we're not alone. And if you can, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who's carrying a kind of longing time couldn't erase. Here on this little virtual porch, there's always room for one more chair, one more listener, one more heart. Because what connects us isn't just the memories. It's the love that survived where no one believed it ever could.